The house was silent when police arrived. No signs of forced entry. No struggle at the door. Just a family home sitting still in the dark, as if nothing had happened. Inside, a mother and her children would be found dead. And the father was gone. Hours earlier, neighbors had seen him acting calm, speaking normally, smiling. Nothing looked wrong. But by morning, that ordinary suburban home had become the center of a nightmare investigators could barely understand. At first, it looked like a disappearance. Then evidence began telling another story. A phone left behind. A lie caught on surveillance. A timeline that made no sense. With every hour, the image of a grieving husband began to crack. Because behind family photographs and quiet routines, investigators were uncovering something no one close to them saw coming. A hidden pressure. A double life. And a plan that may have started long before anyone vanished. What happened inside that house that night was horrifying enough. But what police would later discover about why it happened was even worse. A father stood before cameras pleading for his family to come home. But was he searching for them? Or pretending? How could a father murder his own family? Morning came the same way it always had on that quiet property. The field stretched beyond the house, dew clinging to rows of crops as if nothing had ever disturbed this land. Inside the home, life followed routines shaped over years. Breakfast before sunrise. Work divided without discussion. Doors left unlocked. Neighbors waved as they passed. From the outside, they looked like a family built on trust. The father was known as a hardworking farmer, respected in the community, a man whose days began before dawn and ended long after dark. His wife taught at a local school, patient and admired, carrying the kind of warmth people remembered. Their children had grown up between open fields and family obligations, each tied to the land in different ways. This was a household shaped by discipline, tradition, and silence. Every day seemed familiar. Livestock fed. Crops checked. Meals shared at the same table. Evenings spent under a roof that had held generations. And yet, beneath those routines, fractures had begun to form. Arguments over property had surfaced in quiet exchanges. Money pressures had grown harder to ignore. Old resentments, never fully spoken, lingered in ordinary conversations. A disagreement over inheritance had started as a family matter, then became something heavier. To outsiders, they were close. Inside the home, loyalties had begun to shift. One son had taken over more of the farm operations, believing the land would one day be his. Another felt pushed aside. The mother tried to keep peace. The father refused to bend. What looked like ordinary tension inside a working family was slowly becoming something far more dangerous. Neighbors would later say nothing seemed unusual. But investigators would come to see those final weeks very differently. There were signs. A heated dispute in the barn no one thought much of. A threat dismissed as anger. A change in routine. A locked room that was never locked before. And then, something happened inside that house that would turn a respected family into the center of a murder investigation. Because behind the image of ordinary life, someone in that home had already crossed a line. And the people sitting around that dinner table may not have been as safe as they believed. At first, nothing looked unusual. The family still worked the land. Meals were still shared. Conversations still ended with forced smiles. But investigators would later discover the trouble had already begun, hidden inside ordinary moments no one thought to question. Money was at the center of it. The farm was struggling, debts were mounting, and private arguments over land ownership had turned bitter. What had once been promised as a shared inheritance was now being disputed behind closed doors. One child believed everything had been changed in secret. Another feared being cut out completely. Then came accusations. Small at first. Missing funds. Altered documents. A life insurance policy few knew existed. And suddenly, ordinary disagreements carried a different weight. Family members began choosing sides. Old rivalries resurfaced. A brother's success became another brother's resentment. Private jealousy hardened into open hostility. Then there were rumors of betrayal beyond money. A hidden relationship. Secrets threatening a marriage. A custody battle involving a child no one wanted dragged into the conflict. Each problem alone might have been survivable. Together, they were becoming explosive. Witnesses would later remember arguments growing sharper. Voices raised in the driveway. Doors slammed. Late-night confrontations in the barn. And one warning, spoken in anger, that would later sound far more serious after the murders. Still, no one believed violence was coming. Because from the outside, it still looked like a family under pressure. But pressure was no longer the real story. Someone had begun thinking beyond revenge. And while relatives argued over money, loyalty, and control, a plan may already have been taking shape. Night settled over the farm with an uneasy stillness. Just after 9 p.m., the family was last seen together. Lights glowed through the kitchen windows. Nothing appeared unusual. A neighbor passing the property would later tell investigators everything looked calm. By 10:14 p.m., one family member was seen leaving the barn. That was the last confirmed sighting before the killings. Sometime after midnight, something changed. Investigators believe the first attack happened inside the house. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of a stranger. Whoever moved through those rooms was someone the victims likely knew. A struggle appeared to begin near the hallway. Furniture displaced. A broken lamp. Blood drops leading toward the back door. Then the violence spread. One victim was found in a bedroom. Another near the kitchen. A third outside, near the edge of the property, as though they had tried to run. The murder weapon, according to investigators, may have been something already on the farm. Accessible. Familiar. Close at hand. But the scene raised questions. Because some evidence suggested rage. Other evidence suggested planning. And those two rarely lived together. Then came the contradictions. One family member claimed everyone was asleep by 10. Phone records suggested movement after midnight. A statement about hearing nothing did not match what neighbors reported. And a timeline that first seemed simple, began collapsing. Most disturbing of all. There were indications one victim may have known who was coming. No signs of panic at first. No defensive wounds in the earliest attack. As if the killer approached not as a threat, but as family. By dawn, the property had become a crime scene. Police tape cut across the same fields worked for generations. And investigators standing in that silence began asking a question that would define the case. Was this a violent family argument that turned deadly? Or had the murders been planned long before that night began? By sunrise, detectives believed they were looking at a family tragedy. By nightfall, they weren't so sure. The first clue came from the crime scene itself. Something was missing. Signs of violence were everywhere, yet some evidence appeared almost arranged. Investigators began questioning whether the scene had been altered after the killings. Then suspicion shifted. A surviving family member gave a detailed statement. Too detailed. The timeline sounded rehearsed. And detectives noticed small inconsistencies each time it was repeated. Then came the first reversal. Phone records placed that person awake and moving during hours they claimed to be asleep. Calls deleted. Messages erased. Location data raising questions no one expected. Suddenly, grief was no longer the only thing being examined. Then another clue surfaced. A witness came forward about an argument days before the murders, an argument involving threats over inheritance. At first, detectives thought it was motive. But forensics pushed the case in another direction. Footwear impressions near the barn did not match initial statements. A trace of blood appeared where no victim had been attacked. And hidden in a shed investigators searched twice before. They found something overlooked. Something tied directly to the night of the killings. The case turned again. Attention moved to a second relative. Jealousy. Debt. A possible insurance payout. It fit. Until another contradiction surfaced. That suspect had an alibi. Or so it seemed. Detectives pulled surveillance. Reviewed timestamps. Compared witness accounts. And the alibi began to crack. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A phone recovered from the property held deleted communications. Messages discussing the land. The will. And one line investigators could not ignore. A line that sounded less like anger. And more like warning. Now detectives believed they weren't looking at one lie. But several. Family interviews grew tense. Stories no longer matched. One sibling blamed another. Another claimed evidence was being planted. Every answer opened another question. Then forensic analysis delivered its own shock. Evidence suggested the murders may not have unfolded the way everyone believed. The first victim may not have been the intended target. Which meant motive itself might be wrong. And once that possibility entered the case, everything had to be reconsidered. Because detectives were no longer asking who had reason to kill. They were asking who had reason to hide the truth. For weeks, the case moved in fragments. Then one interview changed everything. Under hours of questioning, a family member began contradicting earlier statements. Small details shifted. Timelines moved. Facts once spoken with certainty started falling apart. Detectives pressed harder. And then came the discovery they had been closing in on. Documents tied to the inheritance had been altered. The insurance policy had recently changed. And evidence recovered from the property connected one person to a part of the crime scene they claimed never to have entered. That was the break. An arrest came before dawn. Quiet. Without warning. Neighbors woke to patrol lights outside the same family home once seen as ordinary. And still, the full truth had not surfaced. Because after the arrest, investigators uncovered something even more disturbing. The murders may not have erupted from one argument. They may have been discussed before that night. Planned. Measured. Concealed behind routine. At trial, prosecutors laid out a theory of betrayal built from greed, resentment, and deception. Phone records. Forensic evidence. Witness testimony. Every piece began locking into place. Then came the moment no one in the courtroom expected. A confession. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just a quiet admission that broke the case open. But even that confession raised another question. Was one person responsible? Or had someone else helped cover it up? That doubt lingered. Jurors listened as prosecutors argued the murders were committed over control of the family land. The defense claimed investigators forced a narrative. For days, the verdict hung in uncertainty. Then the decision came. Guilty. But even after conviction, one detail continued to trouble detectives. Evidence suggested something happened in those final minutes inside the house that was never fully explained. A final confrontation. Words no one would ever hear. A choice made in seconds. And perhaps a truth buried with the dead. Because when the handcuffs closed and the courtroom emptied, the case appeared solved. Yet some believed the full story had never truly been told. The sentence brought legal closure. It did not bring peace. The family farm was left abandoned, its fields untended, its silence carrying the weight of what happened there. A home once built on blood ties had become known only for betrayal. Relatives stopped speaking. Some believed justice had been done. Others insisted part of the truth was still missing. And that doubt refused to disappear. Investigators closed the case. But questions remained. Why were certain details never fully explained? Why did conflicting evidence suggest more than one person may have known what was coming? And what happened in those final moments before the first attack? Some answers went to prison. Others may have gone to the grave. For those left behind, the damage stretched far beyond the murders. A family line was shattered. Generations divided by suspicion. Children grew up carrying a story they never chose. And in the community, people still spoke about the case in lowered voices. Not because of how brutal it was, but because of who did it. Someone trusted. Someone welcomed at the same table. Someone called family. In the end, this was never only a murder case. It was a story about greed entering a home through familiar doors. About resentment growing where loyalty once lived. About how the greatest threat did not come from outside that house, but from within it. And even now, one question lingers over the land where it happened. Was this truly the act of one person driven to kill? Or was there another betrayal hidden inside the story no one ever uncovered?